remember the exact moment the lift doors closed, not because of the metallic sound they made, but because of the silence that followed. A silence so heavy it felt like it pressed against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. My son's face was the last thing I saw before the doors sealed me inside. A face I had once held in my trembling hands, kissed 1,000 times, and prayed for through sleepless nights. That same face now looked at me without warmth, without hesitation, and without regret. I did not understand it at first. How could I? A mother does not prepare her heart for betrayal from her own child. I thought perhaps it was a mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. I pressed the button repeatedly, my fingers shaking, expecting the lift to respond, to move, to open, anything. But it remained still, frozen between floors, as if it too had decided to abandon me. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing weakly against the steel walls. There was no answer. That was when fear began to creep in, slow and cold like water seeping through cracks. I reached for my phone, but my hands were trembling so much I nearly dropped it. No signal. Of course, there would be no signal here. I laughed quietly to myself then, a broken, hollow laugh, because it seemed almost poetic. Trapped in a box with no way to call for help, just like I had been trapped in a life I never truly escaped. As I leaned against the wall, sliding slowly to the floor, memories began to rise uninvited. Painful, vivid, relentless. Maybe it was the darkness closing in, or maybe it was the realization that my own son had chosen this for me. Either way, my past opened itself like an old wound, refusing to stay buried. I was not always this woman sitting helplessly on a cold lift floor. Once I was full of dreams, simple dreams, but bright ones. I wanted a home filled with laughter, a husband who would stand beside me, and children who would grow up knowing love. I believed in small joys, warm meals shared together, quiet evenings, and the comfort of belonging. But life has a way of rewriting your dreams without asking. I was married young, too young to understand what marriage truly meant, but old enough to carry its weight. My husband was not cruel in the beginning. No, that would have been easier to understand. Instead, he was distant, cold in ways that words cannot fully describe. I kept telling myself that love would come with time, that patience would fix everything. That is what I had been taught, after all, to endure, to adjust, to stay. And so I stayed. When my son was born, everything changed, or at least I believed it did. I remember holding him for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapping around mine, his soft breaths warming my skin. In that moment, I felt something pure and unbreakable, love in its truest form. I promised him then that I would give him everything I never had. I did not realize that promises made in love can sometimes become chains. Years passed, and I poured myself into raising him. Every sacrifice felt worth it. Every tear I hid, every insult I swallowed, every lonely night, it all faded when I saw him smile. He became my world, my reason to keep going. I thought that if I loved him enough, if I gave him everything, he would grow into someone kind, someone who would understand. But I was wrong. The lift remained still, the air growing heavier with each passing minute. I tried pressing the emergency button, but nothing happened. My voice, once again, echoed uselessly in the confined space. "Please, someone help me." But there was no one. And in that silence, I began to understand something I had refused to see for years. This was not just about the lift. This moment, this suffocating stillness, it was the result of everything that had come before it. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment I chose to stay silent instead of speaking up. My son had not become this way overnight. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the cold wall, and let the truth settle in. He had learned it. He had learned it from the life I allowed him to witness, from the way I endured disrespect, from the way I made excuses for others, from the way I taught him, without words, that my pain did not matter. And now, here I was, locked away, discarded, inconvenient. Just like I had always been. I do not know how much time passed. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt endless. My throat grew dry from calling out, my body weak from fear and exhaustion. But it was not the physical discomfort that hurt the most. It was the realization. The realization that the child I had given my entire life to had chosen to silence me. to trap me, to ensure I would not stand in his way. Tears rolled down my face, but I did not sob. I think a part of me had already broken long before this moment. This was just the final crack. I whispered his name softly, not in anger, but in disbelief. How did we get here? The lift, of course, did not answer. And so, with nothing but silence around me, I began to tell my story, not to anyone else, but to myself. Because if I did not speak it now, I feared it would disappear, just like everything else I had lost along the way. I was not always this woman. And before this darkness consumes me completely, I want to remember who I used to be. The air inside the lift had begun to feel different, heavier somehow, as if each breath I took carried the weight of everything I had never said aloud. I leaned my head back against the cold metal wall and closed my eyes, but the darkness behind them was no kinder than the dim light flickering above me. It only made the memories sharper. I was not born into sadness. That is something people often assume when they see a woman like me, quiet, worn down, carrying years in her eyes. But my childhood, though simple, had its own small happiness. We were not rich, not even close, but there was warmth in our home. My mother used to hum while cooking, and my father, though strict, had moments of softness that felt like rare gifts. I remember running barefoot in the courtyard, laughing without thinking about tomorrow. Back then, life was not a burden I had to carry. It was something that simply unfolded day by day. I did not know fear the way I would come to know it later. I did not know silence could hurt more than harsh words. But childhood does not last forever. The first time I realized that my life was not entirely my own was the day my marriage was decided. I still remember how casually it was mentioned, as if they were discussing the weather or a distant relative. No one asked me what I wanted. No one thought they needed to. "You will understand later," they said. I believed them. I thought understanding would bring peace. I thought obedience would bring love. I thought if I did everything right, everything would somehow fall into place. The day I left my parents' home, I cried quietly, not because I did not want to go, but because I did not know what I was walking into. My mother hugged me tightly, her hands lingering as if she wanted to hold me back but didn't dare. There was something in her eyes that I didn't understand then, something that felt like a warning wrapped in silence. If I had understood it, maybe things would have been different. My husband's house did not feel like a home. Not at first, and not later either, if I am being honest with myself. It was large, orderly, and filled with rules I had to learn quickly. Every movement, every word, every expression seemed to be watched, measured, judged. I tried so hard to fit in. I woke before everyone else, worked until my body ached, and stayed quiet even when my heart screamed. I told myself this was normal, that this was what being a good wife meant. When my husband spoke, I listened. When he ignored me, I stayed silent. When he looked at me with indifference, I told myself it was better than anger. At least he did not shout often. At least he did not hit me. It is strange, the things we accept when we are taught to endure. Loneliness became my closest companion. Not the kind of loneliness where you are physically alone, but the kind where you are surrounded by people and still feel invisible. Days blended into nights, and nights into days, until time itself felt meaningless. Then, one day, I found out I was pregnant. I cannot fully describe what I felt in that moment. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something fragile and hopeful. It was as if a small light had been placed inside me, flickering but alive. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had something that was truly mine. During those months, I spoke more to the child growing inside me than I ever spoke to anyone else. I told him my fears, my dreams, my promises. I told him that I would be different, that I would give him a life filled with love, not silence. And when he was born, everything else faded. He was so small, so delicate, and yet he carried a presence that filled every empty corner of my heart. I remember the way his tiny fingers curled around mine, the way his eyes searched for something they did not yet understand. In that moment, I felt needed in a way I never had before. I named him with so much love, whispering his name like a prayer. He became my reason to wake up, to keep going, to endure everything I once thought I couldn't. Every smile of his felt like a reward, every laugh like a victory. When he cried, I held him close, promising him that I would always be there. And I was. No matter how tired I was, no matter how broken I felt, I never let him see it. I wanted his world to be different from mine. I wanted him to grow up feeling safe, loved, and valued. But somewhere along the way, I began to disappear. It happened slowly, so slowly that I did not notice at first. My needs, my desires, my voice, they all faded into the background. Everything became about him. What he needed, what he wanted, what would make his life better. I thought that was what love meant. The lift creaked faintly, a sound that made my heart jump for a moment, but it settled back into stillness just as quickly. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Still nothing. I shifted slightly, my back aching from sitting on the hard floor, and hugged my arms around myself. The cold was beginning to seep in, or maybe it was just the emptiness growing stronger. As I sat there, I realized something that felt both painful and undeniable. I had given my son everything, except the truth. I never showed him my struggles. I never let him see my pain. I never taught him that love is not just about giving. It is also about respect, about understanding, about boundaries. To him, I was always there, always available, always silent. And children, they learn what they see, not what they are told. I remember the first time he spoke to me in a way that hurt. He was still young, barely old enough to understand his own words, but the tone, it was sharp, dismissive. "Why are you like this?" I laughed it off at the time, telling myself he didn't mean it, that he was just a child. But moments like that began to happen more often as he grew older. Small things at first, a raised voice, a careless remark, a lack of patience. Each time, I told myself it was nothing. Each time, I chose silence. Because I did not want to lose him. Because I believed that love meant enduring even the hurt that came from the one you loved most. The light above me flickered again, dimming for a moment before stabilizing. I stared at it, wondering how something so small could feel so important. That faint glow was the only thing keeping the darkness from completely swallowing me. Just like hope had done for so many years. But hope, I was beginning to realize, can sometimes blind you. I pressed my head back against the wall and closed my eyes again, letting the memories continue to unfold. Because the truth was, this story did not begin in the lift. It began long before, in all the moments I chose to stay silent. The silence inside the lift had started to settle into something almost familiar, like a presence that refused to leave. My breathing had slowed, not because I was calm, but because my body had begun to accept that panic would not change anything. I sat there, my knees drawn close, my hands resting loosely in my lap, as if I had nowhere left to go, even in my own thoughts. It is strange how the mind works when there is nothing else to hold on to. It does not stay in the present for long. It escapes, drifts backward, searching for answers in places already lived and lost. I found myself thinking about the years when my son was growing up, the years I once believed were the happiest of my life. He was not always distant. No, that is something I must admit, even now. There was a time when he needed me in ways that felt pure and unquestionable, when he would run to me without hesitation, his small arms wrapping around me as if I were his entire world. "Ammy," he would say, his voice soft and full of trust, "don't go anywhere." And I never did. Even when I was in the same room, he wanted me close. When he slept, his tiny hand would grip the edge of my dupatta as if afraid I might disappear. Those moments, they felt like proof that everything I was enduring had meaning. I told myself that love like that could never change. But love, when not guided, can take forms you never expect. As he grew older, the world began to shape him in ways I could not fully control. School, friends, the environment around him, things I had little influence over. I tried, in my own quiet way, to teach him kindness, respect, patience. But my lessons were always gentle, always soft, perhaps too soft. I never raised my voice. I never forced discipline. I thought that if I showed him love, he would naturally become someone who understood it. But I forgot something important. Love without boundaries does not always create understanding. Sometimes it creates entitlement. The first real shift came when he was in his early teenage years. It was not sudden, not something that could be pointed to as a single moment. It was gradual, like a shadow slowly stretching across a room. He began to question me, not in a curious way, but in a way that carried irritation. Why do you always say the same things? Why don't you understand anything? At first, I smiled through it, brushing it aside. I told myself this was normal, that all children go through phases, that he would grow out of it. But the tone stayed. It became sharper, colder. His patience with me grew thinner, while mine with him only deepened. I listened more, spoke less. I adjusted myself to his moods, his preferences, his expectations. If he was upset, I tried to fix it. If he was angry, I stayed quiet until it passed. I did not realize that in doing so, I was teaching him something dangerous, that his emotions mattered more than mine. There were moments, though, moments that should have opened my eyes. I remember one evening clearly. He had returned home late, his face tense, his movements restless. I asked him gently where he had been, not to question him, but out of concern. He snapped. "Why do you need to know everything? Just stop it." His words were loud, sharp enough to cut through the air. I stood there, stunned, not because he raised his voice, but because of the anger in it. It was unfamiliar, yet somehow not entirely unexpected. "I was just worried," I said softly. But he had already turned away, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. That night, I sat alone in my room, replaying the moment over and over again. I told myself he didn't mean it, that something must have been bothering him, that I should be more understanding. And once again, I chose silence. The lift made a faint clicking sound, and my eyes snapped open. For a brief second, hope surged through me. I quickly pushed myself up, pressing the buttons again, calling out louder this time. "Hello, is anyone there, please?" But nothing happened. The sound faded, leaving behind an even deeper quiet. I slowly sank back down, my brief moment of hope dissolving into something heavier. It felt almost cruel, how quickly it had come and gone. Just like so many moments in my life. I let out a long breath, my gaze fixed on the closed doors in front of me. They seemed so close, yet so unreachable, a barrier that could not be crossed, no matter how much I wished it. Much like the distance that had grown between me and my son. As he entered adulthood, that distance became more pronounced. He no longer shared his thoughts with me. His life moved in directions I could not follow, filled with people and decisions I knew nothing about. When I tried to ask, he would brush me off. "You won't understand." Those words, they stayed with me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't understand the world he was living in, but I understood something else. I understood him. Or at least, I believed I did. I knew his habits, his preferences, the little things that made him smile or upset. I knew the child he used to be. But the person he was becoming, that was someone I struggled to recognize. Still, I held on. I held on to the memories, to the hope that somewhere beneath the layers of change, he was still the same boy who once held my hand so tightly. There were rare moments, fleeting but precious, when I caught glimpses of that boy. A small smile, a softer tone, a brief moment of concern when I wasn't feeling well. Those moments kept me going. They made me believe that everything would be okay. But I was holding onto fragments, convincing myself they were enough. The truth was, the foundation had already begun to crack. I had spent years building my life around him, shaping everything to fit his needs, his desires. And in doing so, I had erased myself completely. I had no voice, no space, no identity beyond being his mother. And perhaps that was where I went wrong. Because when you teach someone that you exist only for them, they begin to believe it. The lift felt smaller now, the walls closer than before. I shifted uncomfortably, my body stiff, my mind heavy with realization. I thought about the meeting I was supposed to attend today, the one he had made sure I would miss. It wasn't just any meeting. It was important to me, something I had worked toward quietly, something that gave me a sense of purpose outside of him. He knew that. And yet, he had chosen to stop me. Not by asking, not by explaining, but by locking me away. A bitter feeling rose in my chest, one I had tried to suppress for years. Was it control? Was it resentment? Or was it something even deeper, something I had refused to name? I closed my eyes again, my head resting back against the wall. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something I had always pushed aside. Not just sadness, but hurt. A deep, aching hurt that came not from a stranger, but from the one person I had loved without limits. And as that feeling settled in, I realized something else. This was not just his story. This was mine too. And I had been silent in it for far too long. The stillness inside the lift had begun to feel less like a moment and more like a lifetime. My body had grown stiff from sitting on the hard floor, but I no longer shifted to ease the discomfort. It was as if the pain had settled into me, becoming something familiar, something I no longer resisted. Time had lost its meaning. There were no clocks here, no voices, no movement, only the faint hum of a machine that had stopped doing its job, just like so many things in my life. I rested my head against the wall again, my eyes half closed, my thoughts drifting deeper into the past. It felt inevitable now, like a path I had no choice but to follow. There was a time when I thought things might change. Not suddenly, not magically, but gradually, like the way dawn replaces night. I believed that as my son grew older, he would begin to understand. That maturity would bring awareness, that life itself would teach him what I had failed to show. For a while, I held onto that belief so tightly that I did not allow myself to see anything else. He began working, building a life of his own. He became busier, more distant, but I told myself that this was a good thing. That it meant he was moving forward, becoming responsible, becoming someone who would one day look back and appreciate everything that had been done for him. I waited for that day. I imagined it in quiet moments, him sitting beside me, his voice softer, his words filled with gratitude. "You did so much for me, Amy," I imagined him saying. But imagination, I would come to learn, can be a dangerous comfort. Because it keeps you waiting for something that may never come. Instead of understanding, something else began to grow in him. Impatience. It showed in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me, not as someone who had given him life, but as someone who simply existed in his space. I remember one afternoon clearly. I had been waiting for him to come home. I had prepared his favorite meal, something I hadn't made in a long time. It took effort. My hands were not as steady as they used to be, my energy not what it once was, but I wanted to do it anyway. For him. When he finally arrived, he barely glanced at the table. "I'm not hungry," he said flatly, walking past me. I stood there, unsure of what to say. "I made this for you," I replied softly. He stopped for a moment, not turning back. "I didn't ask you to." Those words, they lingered in the air long after he disappeared into his room. I remember looking at the food, the care I had put into it, and feeling something shift inside me. Not break, not yet, but something moved, something unsettled. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. "It's just a bad day," I whispered to myself. But bad days began to turn into patterns. He stopped asking how I was, stopped noticing the small things, stopped seeing me. And I continued to make excuses. Because accepting the truth would have meant facing something I wasn't ready for. That love, no matter how deep, cannot force someone to value you. The lift suddenly gave a soft jolt beneath me, and my heart leaped into my throat. I quickly stood up, gripping the side wall for support. "Hello, please, I'm here," I called out, louder than before, my voice trembling with urgency. For a brief second, I thought I heard something outside. A faint sound, maybe footsteps, maybe voices. but it faded as quickly as it came, leaving me once again surrounded by silence. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal of the doors, closing my eyes tightly. "Please," I whispered. But there was no response. Slowly, I stepped back, my hope slipping away once again. Each time it rose, it seemed to fall harder, leaving behind something heavier in its place. I sank back down, my strength fading, my thoughts returning to where they had left off. There was a moment I can no longer ignore, no matter how much I once tried to. It was the first time I truly felt afraid of my own son. Not because he threatened me, not because he raised his hand, but because of the look in his eyes. It was cold, detached, unfamiliar. We had argued, though argued might not be the right word because I barely spoke. He was frustrated about something I didn't fully understand. I had tried to calm him, to reason with him in the only way I knew, softly, carefully. But he didn't want softness. "Why do you always act like this?" he snapped. "Why can't you just stay out of things?" "I'm just trying to help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't need your help," he shouted. The force of his words hit me harder than I expected. I stepped back slightly, my hands trembling. And then he looked at me, not with anger, not even with irritation, but with something worse. Indifference. As if I didn't matter enough to be angry at. That was the moment fear settled into my heart. Because anger, at least, still carries emotion. But indifference, it erases you. I tried to speak again, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. He turned away from me, just like that, as if the moment had never happened. But it had. And it stayed with me. Even now, sitting here in this lift, I can still feel it. That distance. That coldness. It didn't happen overnight. It was built, piece by piece, through years of silence, of unspoken truths, of lessons never taught. And I was part of it. That is the hardest truth to accept. I was not just a victim of what he became. I helped shape it. The thought made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the lack of air. I wrapped my arms around myself again, as if trying to hold together something that was slowly unraveling. Outside, somewhere far beyond these walls, life was continuing. People were moving, talking, living their lives, unaware that I was trapped here, both physically and in memories I could no longer escape. I wondered if he knew what he had done. If he had thought about it, even for a second after the doors closed. Did he hesitate? Did he feel anything? Or had it been easy? The questions circled in my mind, unanswered and heavy. I leaned my head back once more, staring up at the dim light above me. For years, I had told myself that love was enough. That if I gave enough, endured enough, stayed quiet enough, everything would eventually find its way back to me. But sitting here now, locked away by the very person I had loved the most, I began to see the truth more clearly than ever before. Love without respect is not love. It is something else. Something that slowly takes from you until there is nothing left. And as I sat there, alone in the quiet hum of a broken lift, I realized that I had been losing myself long before this moment. I just hadn't allowed myself to see it. Until now, the light above me flickered again, weaker this time, as if even it was growing tired of staying alive in this enclosed silence. I watched it for a long moment, counting each dim pulse as though it might tell me something about how long I had been here. But time here did not behave like time outside. It stretched, folded, disappeared. My throat felt dry now, and my lips slightly cracked from the lack of air circulation. Still, I did not move much. Even movement felt unnecessary, like something belonging to another life. My thoughts had become the only thing that still moved freely. And they had returned, again and again, to my son. To his face when the lift doors closed. There had been no hesitation. That was what hurt the most. Not anger, not even the act itself, but the ease. I pressed my palm lightly against my chest, as if I could calm the heaviness there. It didn't help, Nothing helped. Slowly, my mind drifted to the day before today. The last full day before I was locked inside this steel box and removed from my own life. He had been unusually quiet that morning. I remember noticing it immediately. A mother always notices silence when it does not belong. He was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken. I had asked him gently if everything was all right. He didn't look up. Yeah, he said, a short answer too short. I should have stopped there. I should have known that silence, when forced, is not peace. It is pressure building somewhere unseen. But I didn't. I continued speaking. I have a meeting today, I told him softly, pouring tea into his cup. An important one. I may be back late. That was when he finally looked at me. Not with curiosity, not with interest, but with something sharper. A calculation. Meeting, he repeated. Yes, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I told you last week. It's for the community center project. I remember his expression shifting slightly. Not surprise, something closer to irritation. You don't need to go, he said. The words were so simple that for a moment, I almost didn't understand them. I don't need to, I repeated. No, he said, leaning back in his chair. It's unnecessary. Unnecessary. The word lingered in my mind, longer than it should have. For years, I had been told many things. Be patient, be quiet, be understanding. But never had I been told that my efforts themselves were unnecessary. I placed the cup down carefully. It matters to me, I said quietly. He sighed, as if I were being difficult. Amy, you always make things complicated. That sentence, it struck something inside me, not loudly, not violently, but deeply. Because I had heard it before. In different forms, in different tones. From my husband, from life, from everyone who had ever found my voice inconvenient. I said nothing after that. Silence had become my most practiced response. And perhaps that was my mistake. Because silence, once learned, teaches others that they can speak for you. The lift suddenly shook slightly again, pulling me back into the present. My heart jumped. I looked up quickly, but it settled again just as fast. I exhaled slowly. I was still here. Still trapped. Still waiting. My thoughts returned to the meeting. It wasn't just any meeting. It was a decision point. A step forward in something I had quietly built over years, something that gave me a sense of identity outside of being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's caretaker. It was the first thing that felt like mine. And he knew that. That realization settled in slowly, like a stone sinking into water. He knew. I closed my eyes. The memory of the lift doors closing came back again, sharper this time. His hand near the control panel, the faint sound of the mechanism locking, my confusion turning into realization too late. Wait, what are you doing? I had asked. He hadn't answered immediately. Just looked at me. And then, calmly, almost gently, he pressed the button that sealed me inside. That gentleness is what confused me most. Because cruelty I had expected in loud forms, not quiet ones, not controlled ones, not deliberate ones wrapped in calm expressions. I pressed my fingers against my forehead. Why? The question had been circling me since the moment it happened. Why would my own son do this? The answer, I was beginning to fear, was not simple. It was not one moment. It was not one argument. It was years. Years of him watching me give everything away to others until nothing remained for myself. Years of him seeing me accept things I should have refused. Years of me never drawing a line, never saying enough, never showing him that I, too, had limits. And somewhere along the way, he learned something dangerous. That I could be moved. That I could be stopped. That I could be controlled. A wave of emotion rose in my chest, too heavy to name properly. I swallowed hard, my eyes burning slightly. I had spent my life believing that sacrifice was love. But what if sacrifice, without balance, becomes something else entirely? Something that teaches others to take without asking. My breathing slowed. I could still hear faint sounds beyond the lift now and then. Distant movement. Voices that never stayed long enough to become help. I called out again once, weaker this time. No answer. Of course. I lowered my head. And then, for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think something I had always avoided. Not just about him, but about me. Who had I become? A woman who never said no. A woman who always adjusted. A woman who believed that love meant disappearance. And in that disappearance, had I also taught my son that I did not matter as much as I should? The thought did not come with blame. It came with clarity. Painful clarity. Outside, I had always been available, always reachable, always the one who would delay her own needs. And children, I realized now, do not understand sacrifice the way mothers intend it. They interpret it differently. They build their understanding of the world from what is repeatedly shown to them, not what is meant behind it. I had shown him that I would always stay, no matter how I was treated. And now he believed it. The lift light flickered again, softer this time. I watched it without reacting. My body felt tired, but my mind was no longer only drowning in confusion. Something else was forming beneath it. Awareness. A slow, painful awareness. He had locked me here, not just to stop me from attending a meeting. He had done it to stop something else. My voice outside of him. My identity outside of him. My movement beyond him. I closed my eyes again. And for the first time since the doors shut, I did not ask only why. I asked something harder. What did I become to you? The answer did not come from the lift. It came from within me. And I was not ready for it yet. The question I had asked myself did not leave. It stayed, circling in my mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade. What did I become to you? The lift offered no answer, of course. It only hummed faintly, as if it had nothing to do with human questions, as if my pain was just another noise it had no obligation to acknowledge. I leaned my head back again, my eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The cold metal beneath me had become less uncomfortable now. My body had begun to accept it, just like it had accepted so many uncomfortable things in life. Acceptance, I used to think it was a virtue. Now I wasn't so sure. Because what I had called acceptance for years might have been something else entirely. I closed my eyes. And this time, my memory did not go to my son as a child or even as a teenager. It went to something more recent, something quieter, something I had tried very hard to forget. The time when I started feeling invisible in my own home. It began with small things. A sentence not answered. A glance not returned. A presence ignored as if it were part of the furniture. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People grow busy, lives change, sons become adults, they drift. That is what I believed. But drifting is gradual. What I experienced felt more like being slowly pushed out of my own place in the world. I remember mornings when I would prepare breakfast and he would leave without eating, without even acknowledging that I had made it. I remember standing in the kitchen longer than necessary, waiting for footsteps that never returned. And then I remember the evenings. The worst part of the day. Because evenings used to belong to conversations, even small ones, ordinary ones, about his day, his thoughts, his plans. But slowly, those conversations disappeared, replaced by silence. And screens. Always screens. I would sit nearby, pretending to read, pretending not to notice that I was no longer part of his world. That his laughter, when it came, was shared with something else. Someone else, somewhere else. I started learning how to exist quietly in my own house. How to move without disturbing. How to speak only when necessary. How to make myself small. And the strangest part was, I did it willingly. Because I thought this was love. I thought staying out of the way meant respecting him. I thought giving space meant being a good mother. But what I didn't realize was that I was slowly teaching him something else entirely. That I did not need to be included. The lift shifted slightly again, a soft mechanical sound breaking through my thoughts. I opened my eyes quickly, expecting something, anything, but nothing changed. Still stuck. Still waiting. I exhaled slowly. The memory continued. There was a particular night that stayed with me more than others. I don't know why that one, out of all of them, refuses to leave me. It had been late, very late. I was sitting in the living room, waiting for him to return. I told myself I was not waiting for him, but for reassurance. That was the excuse I used, that it was normal for a mother to wait. When he finally came home, it was past midnight. I remember the sound of the door opening, the soft click of keys, the weight of his steps. I stood up immediately. "You're late," I said gently. He didn't even look at me. "Work," he replied. One word, that was all. I nodded, trying not to let my disappointment show. "I kept dinner for you," I said. He finally looked at me then, but not with gratitude. With irritation. "I told you I'm not hungry," he said. There was something in his tone that night that felt different. Not loud, not aggressive. Final. As if the conversation itself was unnecessary. I remember standing there, unsure of what to do with my own silence. "I just thought," I began. "You always think too much," he interrupted. That sentence. It should not have hurt as much as it did. But it did. Because it didn't just dismiss what I said. It dismissed me. I remember nodding slowly, because I didn't know what else to do. Then I stepped aside, letting him pass as if I were just part of the hallway. And he did. Without another word. That was the night I sat in my room afterward and felt something shift inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But permanently. Something subtle breaking that I did not yet have language for. Back in the lift, I opened my eyes again. My throat felt tight, though I hadn't spoken for a while. I looked at my hands. They looked the same as always, wrinkled slightly, familiar, but somehow they felt like they belonged to someone else now. Someone who had spent too long holding things that were never returned. I tried to think of a moment when I had truly said, no. A moment when I had chosen myself over everything else. But I couldn't find one easily. That realization sat heavily in my chest. Had I ever allowed myself to be more than what others needed me to be? The lift gave another faint sound, like a distant breath. My head turned slightly toward the doors, but nothing changed. Still closed. Still unmoved. I wondered if my son was outside now. If he had noticed yet. Or if, in his mind, I was simply delayed, inconveniently absent for a short time, something that would resolve itself without concern. That thought was more painful than I expected. Because it meant I had become replaceable in his mind, long before I was physically removed from his space. I pressed my hand lightly against my chest again. My heartbeat felt steady but slow, tired. I thought about the meeting again. What I had been trying to build. A space where I could speak, contribute, exist beyond the roles that had defined me for decades. It wasn't large. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something most people would consider life-changing. But it was mine. And perhaps that was why it mattered so much. Because for so long, nothing had been mine. Not even my time. Not even my choices. Not even my voice. And now, even that had been taken from me. A bitter smile formed on my lips for a brief moment, but it faded quickly. Not amusement. Recognition. I had been living a life where even my smallest attempts at independence were seen as unnecessary disruptions. And I had allowed it. Because I believed love required it. Because I believed being needed was enough. But being needed is not the same as being valued. That difference, I was only beginning to understand it now. The lift light flickered again, and I looked up at it, no longer startled. Just watching. Like everything else in my life, it was unstable, inconsistent, unreliable, but still the only source of light I had. I let out a slow breath. Somewhere deep inside me, something had begun to change. Not hope. Not yet. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. Clarity. The clarity I felt did not comfort me. It did not soften the weight in my chest or make the lift feel any larger. If anything, it made everything sharper, each memory more defined, each realization more difficult to ignore. I sat there for a long time, listening to the faint mechanical silence around me, as if the lift itself had become a witness to everything I had never admitted out loud. And then, without warning, my thoughts shifted again, this time not to the past I had already lived, but to the moment I was living right before I entered this lift. The morning of today. It had begun like any other morning, or so I had believed at the time. The sky was pale, soft light filtering through the curtains, and I remember waking earlier than usual. There was a strange feeling in my chest, something like anticipation, though I had not named it then. I had prepared myself carefully, not in a way that others might notice, but in the quiet ways only a woman who has lived invisibly for years would understand. I chose my clothes with care. I arranged my papers neatly. I checked the details of the meeting twice, then 3 times, because I did not want to make any mistake. It was important to me, not just as an event, but as a step toward something I had kept buried inside myself for too long. A part of me had felt nervous, another part hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something different. I remember standing in front of the mirror for a moment longer than usual, looking at myself, not just as a mother, not just as someone's caretaker, but as a person preparing to step outside of those roles. It felt unfamiliar, but not wrong. When I came out of my room that morning, I saw him already awake. My son. He was sitting at the table, fully dressed, his phone in his hand. His face was calm, unreadable, as it often was now. There was a distance between us even when we were in the same space, as if we were both occupying the same house but different worlds. "Good morning," I said softly. He did not look up immediately. "Morning," he replied. That was all. I placed my things near the table, trying to act normal, trying not to let my nervousness show. "I'll leave after breakfast," I said. That was when his fingers paused on his phone. He looked up, and something in his expression changed, subtle, but noticeable enough for me to feel it instantly. "Leave," he repeated. "Yes," I said. "The meeting is at 10. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You're still going to that." The way he said it, it was not curiosity. It was not even disapproval. It was disbelief. As if my decision was something he had already assumed would not happen. "Yes," I said again, a little firmer this time. A silence followed. Not an empty silence, but a heavy one that seemed to gather between us like something solid. I remember waiting for him to say something else, to ask a question, to make a comment. But instead, he stood up. That was the moment everything changed. At the time, I did not recognize it as change. I thought it was just movement, just part of the morning. He walked toward me slowly, his expression still controlled. "You don't need to go," he said again. I remember feeling confused then. "I already told you," I replied gently. "It's important for me." That word, me, seemed to irritate him. He exhaled sharply. "Amy, why do you always make things complicated?" I remember pausing. Because that sentence, I had heard it before, so many times that it had begun to lose meaning, and yet somehow it still managed to affect me. "I'm not making anything complicated," I said quietly. He stepped closer, and then I noticed something in his eyes. Not anger, not sadness, something more controlled. more deliberate. "I don't think you should go," he said. There was a finality in his tone that made my stomach tighten slightly. "Why?" I asked. A simple question. But he didn't answer it directly. Instead, he said something else. "You'll just create unnecessary issues." I remember staring at him then, trying to understand what he meant. What issues? What problem? A meeting I had prepared for, something that mattered to me. How could that be an issue? But before I could respond, he had already moved past me. And that was when I felt it. Something was not right. Not obvious, not loud, but present. Like a thread tightening slowly. Still, I left my room that morning with my documents in hand. I remember standing near the door for a moment, adjusting my scarf, trying to steady myself. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself he was just being dismissive, as he had been lately. I told myself I would still go. That was my last moment of certainty. After that, everything blurred. The lift. The doors. His face. The click. The silence. I blinked slowly, sitting in the present again. My chest felt heavier now than before, because I was beginning to understand something I had avoided for too long. This was not a coincidence. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision. I looked at the lift doors again. Still closed. Still unmoving. My fingers curled slightly against my palm. And slowly, another memory surfaced, one I had not yet allowed myself to fully see. The moment just before the doors closed. I had been speaking, asking, confused, and he had not looked away. Not even once. There had been no hesitation in his hand when he pressed the control. No shaking. No regret. Only focus. A controlled action. Intentional. I closed my eyes tightly. My heart began to beat differently now, not faster. Heavier. Because understanding something is one thing. Accepting it is another. I pressed my hand against the wall of the lift, feeling its cold surface. It felt real. Unmoving. Uninterested in my realization. Just like him, in that moment. I swallowed slowly. And for the first time since this began, I did not ask why did this happen. Instead, a different question formed. One I was not sure I was ready for. What happens after you realize the truth too late? That question stayed with me longer than I expected. Not like a thought that fades when replaced by another, but like something that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. What happens after you realize the truth too late? The lift offered no answer. It never had. I slowly shifted my position, my back aching now in a dull, constant way. Even pain had begun to lose its urgency. Everything inside this confined space was becoming muted, as if the world outside was slowly detaching itself from me. And yet, inside my mind, everything was louder than ever. I found myself thinking again about the moment the doors closed. Not the beginning of it, not the confusion, but the exact instant when understanding first began to form. It had been subtle at first, a flicker of something in my mind that I had refused to name, because numbing it would have meant accepting it, and accepting it would have meant collapsing under its weight. But memory is stubborn. It brings back what the heart tries to bury. I saw it again. His hand. Not trembling. Not uncertain. Just steady. And the sound. That soft mechanical click that sealed me inside. At the time, I had thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something reversible, something temporary. Because that is what a mother believes first, that her child cannot possibly mean harm. But now, sitting here, the truth no longer felt like something I could avoid. It was intentional. The realization did not come all at once. It came in layers, like peeling away something that had been wrapped too tightly for too long. First came disbelief. Then confusion. Then something colder. Recognition. My throat tightened slightly as I breathed in, the air inside the lift feeling thinner than before. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I remembered another detail. His expression. Not angry, not emotional, focused, as if he had already decided something before the moment even happened. I pressed my fingers lightly against my palm again, grounding myself. Why would he do that? The question returned, but now it felt different. Less innocent, less open-ended, more dangerous. Because I was no longer asking it from ignorance. I was asking it from awareness. And awareness begins to connect things that denial keeps separate. My mind drifted, reluctantly, to everything I had said earlier in my life, everything I had done without questioning how it shaped him. The silence I maintained, the boundaries I never set, the way I always stepped back when conflict appeared, the way I always prioritized peace over confrontation. I had thought I was protecting him from negativity. But what if I was also teaching him something else? That resistance would never come. That my voice could be overridden. That my choices could be interrupted. That I would adjust, no matter what. I opened my eyes again. The lift seemed smaller now, though nothing had physically changed. Or maybe it was me. Maybe realization makes spaces feel tighter. I let out a slow breath. Somewhere far above, I imagined life continuing normally. People walking, talking, making decisions without hesitation. No one knowing that I was here, suspended between moments that no longer felt like mine. And then, unexpectedly, my thoughts shifted again. This time to him. Not the child I once held. Not the teenager I once guided. But the man he had become. A man who now made decisions without consulting me. A man who spoke to me less as a mother and more as something secondary. A presence that could be paused. Or removed. My chest tightened slightly at that thought, but I did not push it away. Because I needed to understand it now, even if it hurt. I remembered how often I had adjusted my own life to avoid disturbing his. Appointments delayed. Plans canceled. Desires postponed. Opportunities quietly ignored because it wasn't the right time. And every time I did that, I told myself I was being understanding. But understanding, without balance, slowly turns into disappearance. A faint sound echoed from somewhere outside the lift again. I immediately looked up, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. "Hello," I called out, my voice weaker now but still hopeful. Silence. Again. My shoulders sank slightly. Hope had started becoming exhausting. I leaned back against the wall once more. And then another memory surfaced, this one sharper, more recent than the rest. A conversation. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just final. He had been standing near the window that evening. I remember the light falling across his face in a way that made him look older than he was. I had tried to speak to him about the meeting then, again. Trying to explain. Trying to share. Trying to make him understand why it mattered to me. But he had interrupted me. "You don't need all this," he had said. I remember pausing. "Don't need what?" I asked. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Going out, getting involved, it's unnecessary." Unnecessary. That word again. As if my life had become a list of unnecessary actions. I remember feeling something then that I had not fully understood at the time. Not anger. Not sadness. But something closer to erasure. As if I was slowly being reduced in someone else's mind. And I had said nothing. Again. That silence now felt different in memory. Heavier. More responsible. I opened my eyes slowly. The lift light flickered once more. This time, I didn't react. Because I was beginning to understand something I had avoided for too long. This was not just about a meeting. Not just about being delayed. Not even just about control. It was about everything that had been building for years beneath silence that I had mistaken for peace. I looked at the closed doors again, and for the first time, I did not imagine them opening immediately. Instead, I imagined what would happen after they did. What I would say. What he would say. What I had never said before. My voice. I tested the idea in my mind, like something unfamiliar. It felt distant, almost unused. And that frightened me more than the lift itself. Because I realized something quietly, painfully true. I had not just been locked inside this lift. I had been stepping out of my own voice for years. And now, finally, I was beginning to hear the echo of it again. The echo of my own voice in my mind unsettled me more than the silence of the lift ever could. Because silence from outside is one thing. Silence you build inside yourself that becomes harder to break. I sat still for a long time after that realization, as if any movement might disturb something fragile forming within me. My thoughts no longer felt like scattered memories. They were arranging themselves into something clearer now, something structured, something I could no longer pretend not to see. And yet, part of me resisted it. Because clarity has a cost. It removes excuses. It removes comfort. It removes the soft lies that once made survival easier. I looked at my hands again. These same hands that had cooked for him, cleaned for him, cared for him, waited for him. Hands that had adjusted to every need except my own. I turned them slightly, studying them as if they belonged to someone I was just beginning to meet. Somewhere deep inside, a question formed, not loud but steady. When did my life stop being mine? The answer did not come as a single moment. It came as a pattern, a repetition, a lifetime of small withdrawals from myself. I closed my eyes. And suddenly, I was not in the lift anymore. I was in the kitchen. Years earlier. The sound of utensils, the smell of food, the familiar rhythm of preparing meals that I rarely got to eat in peace. He was younger then. Not a child anymore, but not fully grown either. Standing in the doorway, watching me briefly before leaving again. "Amy, I need money," he had said once. Without thinking, I gave it. Another time. "Amy, I need this." Again, I gave it. It was never about the amount. It was about the habit forming quietly between us. He asked. I provided. No hesitation, no discussion, no question about my own needs. Because I believed that was love. Or maybe I believed that was my role. And roles, once accepted for too long, begin to replace identity. I opened my eyes again, the lift returning around me. Still closed. Still unchanged. But something inside me had changed. I shifted slightly, my back straightening a little without intention. The memory continued. There had been a time when I used to make small decisions for myself, simple things, things I no longer even considered possible. Choosing where to go. Choosing when to rest. Choosing what to want. But slowly, those choices had been absorbed into other people's expectations. First my husband, then my son. And I had mistaken that absorption for duty. A faint sound outside made me lift my head again. "Hello," I called, stronger this time. "I'm inside, the lift is stuck." My voice echoed through the metal walls and disappeared into nothing. No response followed. I lowered my head slowly. It wasn't disappointment this time. It was acceptance of a pattern repeating itself. Unheard voice. Unanswered call. Unacknowledged presence. Just like before. But now, something in me refused to let that remain the only truth. I inhaled slowly. And for the first time, I didn't soften my thoughts to make them easier to carry. I let them be direct. My son had locked me here. Not by accident. Not by confusion. But by decision. The word sat heavily in my mind. Decision. It implied thought. It implied intention. It implied understanding of consequence. My chest tightened slightly again, but I did not push the thought away this time. Instead, I followed it. If it was intentional, then there had to be a reason. Not justification. Not excuse. A reason. And that reason could not be separated from everything that came before. My throat felt dry again, but I swallowed slowly. I remembered how often I had avoided confrontation with him, how I had softened my words even when I was hurt, how I had turned away from moments that needed honesty. I told myself I was preserving peace. But peace built on silence is fragile. It does not last. It accumulates pressure instead. And pressure eventually finds release. I pressed my back gently against the wall again, feeling the cold steadying me. Another memory surfaced, this one sharper than the rest. A day not long ago. He had been sitting across from me, speaking about something I no longer clearly remember, but I remember my own hesitation. I had wanted to tell him something important. About myself. About the meeting. About what I was trying to do. But I stopped halfway. Because I saw his expression. Distracted. Impatient. And I told myself, not now. That phrase had become my habit. Not now. Not the right time. He is busy. He will not understand. Later. Always later. But later kept shrinking until it disappeared entirely. I opened my eyes slowly. The lift light flickered again, softer than before. I watched it carefully now. Not as hope, but as reminder that even unstable things can still function for a while before they fail completely. A strange thought passed through me then. Maybe I had been that light. Flickering. Present. But slowly fading without anyone noticing. I blinked slowly. The thought stayed. And then I felt something shift inside me again. Not fear. Not confusion. Something more grounded. Something that did not depend on anyone else. Responsibility. Not for what he did, but for everything that led to it. The realization did not excuse him. It simply placed everything in a longer line of cause and effect. I looked at the doors again. Still closed. Still silent. But now, I was no longer only waiting for rescue. I was beginning to understand what I would need to say when I was no longer inside this space. If I ever stepped out. Because silence had shaped everything so far. And silence, I realized now, would not fix what silence created. I slowly stood up again, my legs slightly unsteady but supporting me. I placed a hand on the wall for balance. My voice when I spoke next was quieter, but steadier. Not a call for help this time. A statement into the empty space. I need to speak. The words did not change anything outside. The lift did not respond. But inside me, something did. And for the first time since the doors closed, I did not feel only trapped. I felt awake. I need to speak. The words still lingered in the air after I said them, even though the lift did not acknowledge them. They did not echo the way my earlier cries for help had. They felt different, less like a plea, more like something I had finally allowed myself to admit. I stayed standing for a moment, my hand resting against the cold wall for balance. My legs were weak, but not from fear this time, from something else, from years of not standing fully in my own presence. Slowly, I lowered my hand and sat back down again. Not because I had given up, but because I needed to think clearly. And clarity, I was learning, does not come while you are running inside your own emotions. It comes when you finally sit with them. I closed my eyes. And the memories returned again, but this time they did not overwhelm me the same way. They came in sequence, like pieces I was finally arranging instead of avoiding. My son. His childhood. His teenage years. His adulthood. And me. Always me in the background of his life, adjusting, adapting, stepping aside. I used to think being a good mother meant never being the reason for my child's discomfort. But now I wondered, had I mistaken discomfort avoidance for love? Because in avoiding his discomfort, I had absorbed my own. There was a difference I had never fully understood until now. I leaned my head back, breathing slowly. The lift remained unchanged, but I no longer expected it to save me emotionally. My expectation had shifted somewhere else. Inside, there was a memory I had avoided earlier, one that now surfaced without resistance. A conversation I had overheard not long ago. He had been speaking to someone on the phone. His voice had been low, but the tone decisive. I remember pausing outside the room without meaning to listen, but something in his words made me stop. "You don't understand," he had said. "She won't listen unless I stop her." Stop her. At the time, I had not fully processed what he meant. But now, sitting in this lift, the meaning was no longer hidden. My fingers tightened slightly against my palm. So this was not only about disagreement. It was about control. Control over movement. Control over choice. Control over voice. I exhaled slowly. It hurt, but it also clarified something I could no longer ignore. This did not come from nowhere. It had been building, layer by layer, moment by moment, year by year. And I had been part of that construction without realizing it. Not through intention, but through silence, through avoidance, through the belief that love meant surrendering everything without question. A faint mechanical sound echoed somewhere above me, and I looked up instinctively. Nothing changed. Still stuck. Still suspended. Still between spaces that refused to connect. But something inside me no longer felt entirely suspended. I looked down at my hands again. And this time, I did something different. I spoke, not to the lift, not to anyone outside, but to myself. Softly. Clearly. I did not teach him where to stop. The words felt heavy, but they were not unfamiliar. They were simply unspoken until now. I repeated it in my mind. Not as blame. As acknowledgement. Because I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. Children do not only inherit words. They inherit patterns. They inherit boundaries, or the absence of them. They inherit what is allowed. And what is never challenged. I closed my eyes again, and a memory surfaced of him as a child doing something wrong, not harmful, but small, something that needed correction. I had smiled instead of correcting. I had said, "It's okay," when it was. Because I didn't want to be strict. Because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. Because I wanted him to always feel loved. But love without guidance does not always protect. Sometimes it confuses. Sometimes it enables. My chest felt tight again, but I did not stop thinking. The present moment, the lift, the silence, the confinement, was no longer just an event happening to me. It felt like a reflection of something larger. Something that had already been unfolding long before I stepped inside. I opened my eyes slowly. The flickering light above me dimmed for a second, then stabilized again. I watched it carefully. Even unstable things continue until they don't. Just like relationships. Just like roles. Just like identities that are never questioned. A strange calm began to settle in me. Not peace. Not relief. But acceptance of complexity. Because I could no longer reduce this situation into a simple explanation. Not he is wrong. Not I am right. Not even this is punishment. It was something more tangled. Something built over years of miscommunication, silence, expectations, and blurred boundaries. And somewhere in that tangle, I had a role too. The lift remained closed. But my mind no longer felt entirely trapped inside panic. It was working, analyzing, understanding. And that understanding, painful as it was, gave me something I had not felt since the doors closed. Direction. I slowly pressed my hand against my chest again. My heartbeat was steady. Not fast. Not chaotic. Steady. And I realized something quietly. Even if I could not get out immediately. Even if no one answered. Even if the situation outside had already been decided without me. There was still something I had not lost yet. My ability to speak inwardly. To name things truthfully. To see without excuses. And that, I understood now, was the beginning of something I had never fully allowed myself before. Not escape. Not revenge. But awareness that could no longer be undone. Awareness does not free you immediately. It only changes the way the walls feel. The lift was still the same, cold, enclosed, unmoving, but I was no longer only reacting to it. I was observing it. And more than that, I was observing myself inside it, as if I were no longer fully inside the memory of panic. Time had become strange again. Not empty, but layered. Each second felt like it carried multiple versions of me, one who was afraid, one who was remembering, and one who was beginning to understand. I stayed seated, my back resting against the wall, my hands loosely clasped in front of me. And I thought about him again. Not as the child I once carried. Not as the boy who once held my finger tightly in public places. But as the man who had looked at me this morning with certainty. The certainty that I would not leave. That I would not go. That I could be stopped. That thought made something inside me tight, not in pain, but in recognition. Because certainty like that is not born in a day. It is built. It is learned. It is reinforced. I closed my eyes again, and the memory of this morning returned once more, but now I examined it differently. His words. His tone. His decisions. Not as isolated actions, but as part of a pattern. He did not ask me to stay. He told me I should not go. And when I still intended to go, he acted. My breathing slowed slightly as I processed that without pushing it away. There was a difference between disagreement and control. A difference I had once blurred because I believed emotional closeness would prevent harm. But emotional closeness, I now understood, does not automatically create respect. Respect is taught separately. It is demonstrated through boundaries, not just love. I opened my eyes. The lift light flickered again, and this time I did not even look up immediately. I already knew it would not change my situation. But I still noticed it. Because awareness changes observation, even when it does not change outcome. I shifted slightly, my legs aching but manageable now. And I thought about something else. The meeting. Not just as an event, but as a symbol. It represented something I had quietly built for myself without asking permission. Something that existed outside his daily control. Outside my home. Outside the identity I had been living for decades. It was not large. It was not dramatic. But it was mine. And I think that was what mattered more than I had allowed myself to admit before. Because for a long time, I had not been me in any active sense. I had been mother, wife, caretaker, listener, adjuster, absorber, but not decision maker, not participant in my own direction. And that realization carried a strange weight, not just sadness, but also something like grief for a self I had postponed for too long. A faint sound echoed again outside the lift. This time closer. I lifted my head quickly. "Hello," I called out again, stronger than before. "I am still inside." My voice did not tremble as much this time. Not because I was less afraid, but because something in me had started refusing to disappear completely. A pause. Then distant movement. But no clear response. Still no opening. I exhaled slowly and leaned back again. It was becoming clear now that waiting alone would not define what happened next inside me. Something had already shifted. Not externally, but internally. And internal shifts are the ones that do not reverse easily. I thought about him again. And this time, I did not soften the thought. I let it stay sharp. He had chosen to prevent my movement. Not through discussion. Not through disagreement. But through physical containment. That fact, once acknowledged without denial, changed the shape of everything else. Because it was no longer just emotional conflict. It was action. And action always reveals intent more clearly than words. I pressed my fingers together lightly. My heart felt steady, but not light. Steady like something preparing itself. I realized I was no longer asking, "How did we get here?" in confusion. I was asking it in sequence, in causation, in understanding. And that shift mattered. Because confusion keeps you stuck in circles. But understanding begins to move in lines. I looked at the closed doors again. Still unchanged. Still holding me inside. But I no longer saw them only as an ending point. I saw them as a threshold. Something that would eventually open. And when it did, it would not be the same version of me that stepped out as the one who stepped in. I didn't know yet what I would say to him. I didn't know yet how the outside world would respond. I didn't even know what consequences this moment would carry. But I knew something else now. Silence would not be my only response anymore. Not after this. Not after everything I had begun to see. And for the first time since the doors closed, I did not feel like I was only waiting to be released. I felt like I was preparing to re-enter. The lift did not suddenly change. It did not open with drama or apology or sound. It remained exactly as it had been since the moment the doors closed, cold, sealed, indifferent. But I was no longer the same woman who had first sat down in panic. That realization did not come like relief. It came like quiet certainty. I sat still for a while longer, letting everything settle inside me. Not to escape the situation, but to understand what it had already revealed. My son had locked me here. That fact remained unchanged. But the meaning of that fact had become layered now, no longer simple enough to reduce to confusion alone. I thought of him again. Not with softness. Not with blind defense. But with a clearer understanding of distance. Somewhere along the years, the bond between us had stopped being mutual understanding and had turned into expectation without reflection. I had expected him to remain the child who would always need me gently. He had learned instead that I would always yield. And between those two assumptions, something had gone unbalanced. I exhaled slowly. The air felt slightly different now, not physically, but internally. As if my breathing had finally stopped carrying only panic and had begun carrying thought. I looked at my hands once more. They were still mine. But I was finally seeing how much of my life I had allowed to be shaped through them, without ever asking what I needed in return. A faint mechanical sound echoed again outside. Closer this time. My head lifted immediately. This time, I did not call out desperately. I waited. And after a moment, I heard movement, clearer now, deliberate. Voices somewhere beyond the metal doors, not distant anymore. The outside world was near again. My heart beat slightly faster, but not in fear. In readiness. I slowly stood up, steadying myself against the wall. My legs felt weak, but they held. And in that moment, I understood something quietly powerful. Whatever waited outside this lift would not erase what I had realized inside it. The doors finally began to respond, slow movement, hesitant at first, then more certain. A thin line of light appeared between them. Light. Real light. Not flickering. Not uncertain. I stared at it without moving. Not rushing toward it. Not retreating from it. Just witnessing it. The gap widened. The sound of the mechanism filled the space. And as the doors slowly opened, I saw the corridor outside, blurred at first. Then clearer. People, movement, life continuing. And somewhere in that space beyond the lift, I knew he was there. My son. The one who had closed me in. The one who had shaped so many of my silences. The one I had loved more than I had ever loved myself. For a brief moment, I did not step forward. Not because I was afraid, but because I was no longer the same person who would step out without thought. I took one slow breath, and then I moved. Not rushing, not collapsing, just walking forward into the space where my silence would no longer be the only language I knew. And as I crossed the threshold of the lift, I understood the final truth this silence had given me. I had not only been locked inside a lift, I had been locked inside years of unspoken things. And now, I could no longer pretend I had never heard them.